where lust for a whole life and nothing but less makes people jump out of a comfortable pond into an unknown ocean. Welcome to that journey between the East and the West. Who says Rolling Stones don't gather moss? Hello, everyone. I am Meenu Gupta, your host for the day, and I'm delighted to have you join me every week as amazing people share their incredible and inspiring life stories of straddling continents. Thank you. What or who is common between Gandhi, who is called Mahatma by the world, Anagarika Dharmapala, a well-known Buddhist monk who is said to have made Buddhism global, and Swami Vivekananda, the Hindu monk who is central to the movement of modern spirituality in the West? The common link is Ruth Harris. Dear listeners, it is my deepest pleasure and honor to host Ruth in our podcast Between the East and the West. She's a well-known historian and an academician. Educated in America, she gained her doctorate in Oxford, and since 1979, she's lived in Britain, France, and Italy. She's a fellow of the British Academy and a Guggenheim Fellow, as well as a winner of the Wolfson Prize and the National Jewish Book Award. She's written widely on topics in the history of religion, politics, gender, healing, science, and spirituality. Thank you for joining us today, Ruth. It is a deep pleasure, and as mentioned, it is an honor.
Thank you for having me.
So, my first question, when I saw that you were originally from the US and you sort of lived in Britain, UK, and Italy, and France, where is home for you, Ruth?
Home is Britain. And I think the reason for that is simple. It's where I work and also where my children were born. And my husband is also British. So yes, this is my home. But I identify still, despite the fact that I now have British passport, as an American, because it's hard to disown where you were raised. And I am still very American in many ways, as my British friends always tell me.
In what way? Just an example. What is American in you?
What's American in me, I suppose, is, as I said at the beginning of the book, one of the things that was very interesting for me is how people thought they were spiritual and not religious in America. And this was a really big part of our childhood. Many people were giving up conventional religion and they thought they were, quote, spiritual. They talked a lot about their spirituality, especially the women. And what fascinates me is why it was that they turned to things like yoga and mindfulness when they knew so little about India or South Asia and never planned to go and never read the sacred texts, but why they thought that that was a path for them. So that's a very old question for me. And there's a question that came to me as an American. And one of the reasons why is that in the 19th century, Americans felt that they were closer to Indian thought than many British because they read transcendental texts from Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau, things of that kind. And so this talk of spirituality, which in Britain might make people a bit more nervous, was actually part of common parlance. So that's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So, to tell me once again, why would it make the British nervous?
Well, the British talk about the spirituality now too, and they do all the mindfulness and yoga. But for many, they tend to be more reticent about spiritual feeling. And they don't talk about themselves as spiritual beings in the same extent as many as my American friends did. And I think that's very interesting and rather different. Even though the British were very interested in Orientalism and Indian subjects, and in many ways much more serious about their study than the Americans. And so that is a difference. I mean, today, people, of course, do engage with all these things in Britain. But it isn't from Britain that the questions about India really emerge. It emerges from my American past. And I think that's something that I can't deny.
We have really plunged into the deep end. What is spirituality and what is religion? And how and where do they interconnect in minds of people in different parts of the globe? In this case, America and Britain. Ruth describes her orientations, inclinations, and definitely her opinions on her identifications.
I mean, it also emerges from being a historian basically of France. I think I explained that in the book, which is called Guru to the World, I talk about how I was stunned by reading about Romain Rolland and his interaction with Gandhi. And they became friends, but they became friends through a British woman named Madeleine Slade, who was the daughter of a British admiral. Basically, Rolland gave her to Gandhi. And they became friends, Roland and Gandhi. And it was fascinating to me how he thought, Roland, that he needed Eastern spirituality, Eastern wisdom, Eastern ideas, and people like Gandhi to revivify Western civilization because it had become brutal and violent after World War I. And it's really interesting that he doesn't want the West to become Indian, but he does want the recovery of mysticism and awe and compassion that he now associates with Eastern wisdom. So that is also just was an extraordinary eye-opener to me. And he wrote a book on Vivekananda and on Ramakrishna. And I didn't know that. And that was a big shock.
The book that we are talking of is the book that you wrote a while ago, and that was called
Guru to the World, The Life and Legacy of Vivekananda.
I see. And in that same book, you have also drawn up on a meeting which took place in December between 6th and 11th in 1931 between Gandhi and Slade and Roland. So, my question to you, which most people don't know, therefore, I would like you to tell us everybody would know Gandhi.
Right.
But who was Roland and who was Slade? Just to get a perspective. And these two men got together to enhance East and West collaboration with Slade. So, from what I understand, from little bites from your book, there are very interesting connotations of gender, religion, politics all came together in this triangle.
Yes, it's fascinating because Roland was a man who left France and he went to live in Switzerland and he wrote a very famous pamphlet called Above the Melee. He became a pacifist in the midst of World War I and he was considered a traitor by his countrymen. And he was a very famous French intellectual and he was very close not only to Gandhi, but especially to Tagore. And he had a close relationship with Tagore. Tagore came to see him. And basically, they had like a game that they played where Roland was meant to represent the West and the right side of the brain, and Tagore was meant to represent the East and the left side of the brain. And that East-West collaboration was about how he put the two sides of the brain together. He remained in Switzerland, and he invited at one point, he came across Madeleine Slade, who was, as I said, a British admiral's daughter. She was a member of the establishment. She was aimless, hurt. Life was difficult for her in her home. She wasn't married. And they came into contact and they became very close friends. And she wants to go and visit and be with Gandhi. And basically, Roland gives her to Gandhi. And it's again, Gandhi sees it as a present from the West to the East. And of course, it's a bit tricky. Here are these great men giving women and that's how they did it. They write in the letters, this woman is a gift to you. And Gandhi says, thank you for your gift.
There's a letter stating that.
Yeah. They talk about her as a gift.
Oh my God. And did she know that? And gift in what way? What was supposed to happen?
Well, it's not clear, really. He goes earlier and she stays with Gandhi and she, of course, is well known as an intimate element of his entourage in the ashram, then later in prison. And also she is the one who comes with him to London. She's the one who tends him when he comes to London for the Roundtable Conference.
Who was Madeleine Slade? Born in 1892, also known as Mirabean, she was a British supporter of the Indian independence movement who in the 1920s left her home in England to live and work with Mahatma Gandhi. She devoted her whole life to human development and the advancement of Gandhi's principles thereafter. But how did she come to meet Gandhi? Being passionate about Beethoven's music, she had read Romain Rolland's books on him and later met Roland as well. During this meeting, Roland mentioned Gandhi, whom he described as another Christ and as the greatest figure of the 20th century. On her return to England, she read Roland's biography of Gandhi. This convinced her to become a disciple of the Mahatma. Rather than embarking for India right away, Mirabai decided to prepare herself for the change by studying material on the Sabarmati ashram, sitting cross-legged and adopting a vegetarian diet. It is said that when she arrived in India, Gandhi called her his daughter and treated her like one as well.
She's the one who prepares the food and does everything. And yes, she comes and she is treated as, this special person to almost confirm this friendship. But what's so interesting there is, again, he's trying to assert Roland, the nature of the collaboration. And he even hopes that Gandhi will come and lead the anti-fascist movement in Europe because he feels they need a moral leader. And Gandhi explains that everyone in each society must do what they can according to their own needs, and that he's not there to fight against European fascism. He's there to free India. And there are things that Gandhi just won't accept, but they remain friends. And it's part of, he tries to convince Gandhi not to go and see Mussolini, because Gandhi does go and see Mussolini, because he doesn't feel that Gandhi properly understands the nature of European fascism. Whereas Gandhi feels he understands fascism. He sees it as an extension of imperialism. And he's interested in Mussolini's reforms around the peasantry and around, he's interested in how ancient societies come together. And Italy is one of the examples that he's interested in. So he does go to, in the end, and he ignores Roland's advice, just as Tagore ignores Roland's advice and goes to Italy. So you see, he's a very important figure, and he's seen as one of the great intellectuals of the interwar period. And for a whole decade, he's very engaged in Eastern thought and Indian thought. And it's only when he realizes this isn't going to work against fascism that he becomes a fellow traveler of communism.
So, what I understand is that he came together for his own purpose in the sense he thought he would gain Gandhi's cooperation for Europe, which didn't sort of happen because Gandhi's focus was India, which is also understandable because India was at that time ruined as a subject.
But it's also funny because you see him just projecting onto Gandhi. When he opens the door and he sees Gandhi, he thinks, he's like St. Francis of Assisi.
I understand. So, yeah, he thought this was the solution, and that didn't sort of happen. I'm gathering that he might have been disappointed. Now, all this you gathered from letters, reading material, and what else?
What I've just explained is mostly an article. And from there, I left the work on Roland and Gandhi. But it was through Roland and Gandhi that I came to read more about Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, because Roland had written a book on each of them. And that was my beginning. So it's through the French interpreter of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda that I first came to these great Indian thinkers and sages, religious philosophers of the 19th century. And that was the beginning. And that's where I wrote the book called Guru to the World, which was about Vivekananda, who decided, even though he was uninvited, to come to Chicago in 1893, to what's called the World's Parliament of Religions, and to explain to the West about what Hinduism was and why he was opposed to Christian mission. And that's what he did. So he became a very well-known figure in America, but died in 1902, right before the first mass outbreak of nationalism, which is called Swadeshi, in 1904-5, when Bengal was partitioned.
Okay. But what drove you to writing on the subject? What attracted you? What exactly the word, what drove you really to write on the subject of Swami Vivekananda? What was that one thought or feeling? Why did you want to go deeper into the subject?
I wanted to go deeper into the subject because I was interested in not how the West had impact on the East through colonialism and imperialism. I was more interested to see how people from other societies had changed us, even though it was the height of imperialism. And hence, I was trying to understand the beginnings of the interest in yoga, mindfulness, and so-called Eastern spirituality. And at the same time that I was asking myself this question, I began to read the letters of Swami Vivekananda, and they were so funny and so humane and so clever that I began to get interested in him as a human being.
Born in the year 1892, Swami Vivekananda was an Indian Hindu monk, philosopher, author, religious teacher, and the chief disciple of the Indian mystic Ramakrishna. He was a key figure in the introduction of Vedanta and yoga to the Western world, and is credited with raising interfaith awareness and bringing Hinduism to the status of a major world religion. He was so impactful at the Parliament of Religions in the year 1893 that an American newspaper described him as an orator by divine right and undoubtedly the greatest figure at the Parliament. That famous speech of Swami Vivekananda began with the words, "Sisters and Brothers of America." With these words, he floored the nation. Interesting. So I love the idea what you brought forth, that at that time when one thought that the imperialism of the West was the influence on the East, you were trying to figure out the influence of the East on the West in terms of wisdom and spirituality that flew. My question is, what is the notion of Eastern wisdom, and that contrasts spirituality with materialism then and now? Because you've been going through the history of it. So then and now would be actually interesting. You've read letters, you've actually gone through everything.
Yeah, I think that this dichotomy of the East is spiritual and the West is as materialistic has its origin in Orientalism, that somehow, the East is exotic and spiritual and the West is rational and materialistic. And the dichotomy, the polarity, has both a good side and a bad side for both sides. The good side for the West is that it knows how to make wealth and to be organized. The good side for the East is that it's more spiritual and understands spiritual values more. But the bad side is that the West is brutal, violent, inclined to conquer, and the East is subject and passive and nihilistic. So it can be both good and bad, the materialism versus the spirituality. And what Vivekananda tried to do was to insert himself into that vision, but to concentrate on the positive side of that spiritual thing and to really scold Americans and Euro Americans, Europeans, about their loss of spirituality and to get them to rethink about spiritual values. And at the same time, it was also very difficult for him because he didn't want to come across as a sadhu who just went off into the forest and who contemplated the world. He also was very, very concerned that Hinduism in India should be transformed by what he called practical Vedanta, that Indians should be concerned with social uplift, moving the society forward, and learning agency so that they could resist the West. So his message was very different in the two places.
Is it true? Because it is said in many places, but from your research, is it true that he's the person who made yoga and meditation part of the Western culture from that time onwards? Or not even part, a little bit part?
Yeah, I think it starts with him. I mean, he comes in the 1890s. He comes in 1893. And by 1894, in the summer, he's already giving lessons in yoga under what they call the Swami's pine. It's a pine tree up in Maine. It was a progressive place for people to think about alternative spiritualities, healing. There were a lot of Western things on offer. There was homeopathy. There was what they called New Thought. There was mesmerism, hypnotism. And what Vivekananda did was he thought He was very interested in what everybody was doing. He tried to see what interested them. He recognized they were interested in both physical and spiritual healing. And then he began, under what they called the Swami's Pine, to give these lessons and explain to them two things. One, about the nature of meditation and how it could change them and their spiritual searches. And the other thing was that they should not be just concerned with healing and miracles. They should be concerned with the spiritual search in and of itself. And he introduced them to to aspects of Eastern thought that they had never heard before. So by 1896, he finally writes the first self-help book on yoga, and it's called Raja Yoga. So that's the first one that arrives in the West, and it is still classic today. And people don't realize it's so long ago. They think it came with the Beatles or something in the 1960s, but that's not what happens.
That's what essentially what people know from one part of the world to the other. Nowadays, of course, social media, before that, television and the great BBC and the channels, and some books. But what I understand and what I see constantly, sometimes there are biases, both sides. Sometimes what one sees on the media is only one blip on the globe. So, for example, India is a mosaic of different things, cultures, languages, levels of classes, illiteracy merging with literacy, richest people along with the poorest. However, what the media would always pick up now, and it's been there for a while, is either the most decrepit or the most amazing, because that is what attracts the human attention and their audience. So, therefore, a lot of relevant material and understanding, wisdom, etc., get lost. That is between the top and the bottom. It gets lost between. So, therefore, when somebody like you comes on the fore, you've actually gone through material and reels and realms and the letters and so on. So, you're bringing a studied perspective to the subject of understanding what flew from A to B and what flew between A from B to A. It and then and now. And since you are living there, so I was very curious. So now you've gone through in a historical way through all that material, and there's another world that you are living in now. The relevance of that material now. What was you just spoke about the influence, then what happened? What is the relevance of that now in the period that we are living in?
I think the relevance is that exemplify forms of conversation and exchange and dialogue that were really important and continue to be important in understanding each other. And that is for me, the major thing. The reason why I love the stories so much is that one of them is coming in the West, is coming from Christianity and all the different kinds of Protestant sects and all kinds of ideas about healing and mesmerism. And Swami Vivekananda has spent 5 years traveling all over India, had a 5 year discipleship under a very charismatic and unusual guru named Ramakrishna. And yet they find a way to converse. And they try to find a way to converse seriously. And despite the asymmetry in power, because of course, Vivekananda is always fighting against these terrible stereotypes of India. And yet, with his devotees, with the people he meets, he keeps on trying to explain what it might mean to think about religion and society and race in a different way and from a different perspective. And he keeps on trying to explain his perspective in a strong way. And they really try to listen. Sometimes they understand each other, but most often they don't, but they keep on trying. And if you want to say, why is that relevant to today? I think that's what's relevant. The attempt to keep on trying to understand one another, even if we recognize we can only see things through the lens of our own culture. And that is what really inspired me to write the book.
You also worked on there was another gentleman, Anagarika Dharampal, the Buddhist monk, again an Asian influence on the West in those times, 19th century, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, he comes to the World Parliament too. Yes.
His name is not so well known outside smaller circles, and yet he is somebody who began a whole wave. So, can you tell us a little more on that?
Yeah, he's a very interesting man, Dharmapala, because he comes from Ceylon or Sri Lanka, but Ceylon in the 19th century. He's a Theravadan Buddhist. And what's so interesting is you compare him to Vivekananda, who has this guru, whereas Dharmapala is a Buddhist from a very orthodox family, but he never has a Buddhist master or teacher or a guru. Instead, what's remarkable is that his training comes from the Theosophists, who are Western.
Let me understand and absorb that. So, his training came from the West influence.
No, they come to Sri Lanka, the Theosophists. They are famous people called Helena Blavatsky and Alcott. They found the Theosophical Society in New York, and they come to Sri Lanka because they're opposed to Christian mission. They want to open up this vision of universal brotherhood. And they arrive and they meet Dharmapala, but especially Dharmapala's parents and his contacts.
The Buddhist monk, whom Ruth is referring to, was the first Buddhist monk in modern times to preach the Dhamma in 3 continents: Asia, North America, and Europe. In Buddhism, Dhamma means cosmic law and order, as expressed by the teachings of the Buddha. Dhamma is one of the 3 refuges of Buddhism, the 3 refuges being Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Dhamma means to uphold, and therefore it is the central theme of Buddhism, while it holds up the religion. Let us explore more.
And they begin to fight for the rights of Buddhist processions and religious observance and Buddhist education in Sri Lanka. And so he becomes very attached to them, and especially to Madame Blavatsky, and then afterward to Alcott when she dies. So it's a very, very, very different trajectory for Swami Vivekananda on one side and Anagarika Dharmapala on the other. It's completely different. And he also meditates and learns to meditate and travels all over the world and spreads a vision of Buddhism. But he's very different from Vivekananda. He is basically interested in the Sinhalese, the Buddhist majority, and he has real difficulties with the Buddhist minority. And at the same time, he wants to create a Buddhist universalism. He contacts people all over the world and tries to save the site of the Buddha's enlightenment at Bodh Gaya and to take it away from the Hindus. He never succeeds during his lifetime, but he is the one who tries to create a Buddhist Mecca for people from all over. And he travels to Japan and Thailand and Cambodia and all kinds of places to try and get support for this international vision of Buddhism. So both of them are international travelers. They travel all over the world. They meet Americans. They meet Europeans. They collaborate with Europeans. Dharmapala is a great collaborator of the man who wrote The Life of the Buddha, the one that, everybody reads in English, Arnold. It's after the Bible, one of the best sellers in England in the 19th century. And they work together to try and restore these sacred Buddhist sites. And what is interesting there is that, he ultimately fights with the Theosophists, but he never gives up being a Theosophist. He is constantly wants to be in communication with the Mahatma, Blavatsky's Mahatma. I mean, this is a person named Kuthumi that doesn't really exist. It's part of his ideal. And it's fascinating that he both is very much almost a Buddhist chauvinist and at the same time wants to embrace everyone with what he sees as the love and compassion associated with the Buddha. I mean, it's a very, very different take on what we normally think of as Buddhism as being mild. It's not mild. When he's at home, he's really very angry, and he is very much opposed to the Muslims and the Tamils. And he articulates a vision of Buddhist superiority. And it's very interesting that we always associate Buddhism with mildness. But as we see today with the Rohingya, the Buddhists are not necessarily mild. You know, there's traditions of, and it's very important in Dharmapala's identity, that he defend the Buddhists against what he sees as the polluting incursions of Hindus and what he calls the Moors, namely the Muslims.
What is your opinion? You've gone very deep in all these people, no? Understanding the journey of Gandhi and the intentions in Swami Vivekananda and also Anagarika Dharmapala, the Buddhist. That is them. So you've gone really deep into them and they were then. What is your impression? You have also, I believe, you also traveled to the East while you were going so much in depth. What is your take between the East and the West? When you go to the East, what do you see? You see differences or you see similarities between the East and the West?
I see both. I see both, as one always does, you know. But I also, the differences are so, in the early stage, the differences are electrifying. The first impression, it's wonderful to be someplace different. And then the second impression is how many of my impressions are sort of seen through a veil of Orientalism. You know, what the West has already made into a cliche about the East. And then you have Indian friends and Sri Lankan friends, as I do. I have especially many, many Indian friends. And you realize that their lives and their views are as diverse as anyone anywhere. But they will, at moments, just look at me and say, "Oh, you say that because you're a Westerner." They will. They'll say, "You don't get it." And there are moments, for example, when they talk about their family life. That's one thing where you feel that, yes, you can understand all the emotion and the passion. That's universal. But the things that we would do, some people, my Western friends would do in terms of distancing themselves or are just not the solutions that the Indian friends. So, for example, what'll be is even if there's a great conflict, both sides give in a bit because they feel they can't have the break. Whereas in the West, often, not always, it's again very individual, people will often go through a period of breaking, even if they ultimately come back. And I found that very, very interesting. For example, one of my Sri Lankan friends, she speaks every day to her mother. And I found out that some of my Indian friends do that too. And I don't know one of my Western friends who does that. And it's not wrong or right. It's just very different.
That's interesting. I didn't think of that. Do tell me more. It's a very interesting aspect.
Well, they feel the need. Well, they're also abroad. So they often feel the need to connect with their families all the time because they miss them, you know, in a way that we don't. We're in our own culture. So these Indian friends are always in the West trying to negotiate. They're being someplace foreign where they also feel very comfortable because they've made their lives here, but also missing home and needing to be in touch. I have another Indian friend who's a twin. Every day he calls his twin in Bombay, every day. And yet he has a full life here, but he wants to connect every day. And it's a very rare thing. I know there are people who do it here, but I have no friends who do it.
Interesting, because it brings out a very classical, deep difference in, and that comes how depends upon the way one is brought up. It all boils down to that, and boils down to the parental culture at home and the influences. So you are saying that the close knit connections one might have with the next of kin is not as in the West.
I don't think it's not in the West, but it's not expressed in that way with constant contact. Yeah. And also the idea is that you need not to have that dependence. Even if you feel it, you're not allowed to give into it. Whereas with these Indian friends, they don't feel it's a dependence. It's just their love being expressed. And that's part of the family unit. But we feel we're not allowed to be like that because do you see what I'm saying? And that's a very different way of being because they keep people with them every day.
Yes. So actually, that brings to the subject of individualism versus the other. In the East, generally, the we is collective, individuality versus collectivism. No, what I understand from my interactions now when I went deeper into the subject is it somehow the we-ness, let me put it that way, somehow threatens the identity of the individual or gets into the borders of the individual. And you rightly put it, it's a different way of being. The cultural construct of different societies dictates individualism and collectivism. Ruth opines that the basic human needs and emotions may be similar in the East and the West. However, their ways of expression are quite different. And I add to that by saying that the value systems of different societies are different, thus giving birth to different priorities and different lenses of feeling, thinking, and observation, and definitely of doing.
It is. And yet sometimes it's a cliche because there are many young Indians now who want more freedom and want to be detached more from their families. They don't, but nonetheless, they feel often guilty when they detach in ways that perhaps people from other cultures would not. So it's very tricky, isn't it? I agree that the we-ness is still a fundamental aspect. For example, when a family member is in trouble, people really rally round. And they will rally round not just in the immediate family, but connections further afield. If there's a need for money or help with medical care or any of those things, the Indians will come into play. The larger family network in a way that would be not even thought of here. So it's a different way of approaching the world's problems. When bad things happen.
Yes. So it is essentially play of values, different sets of values and priorities individuals grow up with, essentially, on both sides of the so called divide. I call my dad every day. So, and it's not strange, it's very normal.
Yeah, it's really very normal, but it's much rarer here. And of course, it's so sweet. It's wonderful. Why not? To have such closeness is such a joy, and to be able to do it now with WhatsApp, it's just great.
Yes. Society is undergoing through a lot of changes. Question is, when these changes have settled, what will happen then?
Yeah, can they settle? Can they settle? I mean, the fact is, what's so interesting is that on the micro level, people feel the changes. And then on the macro level, they feel it in terms of their jobs. So they're constantly negotiating all these different things. That can make a lot of mental stress.
You've put it quite well, actually. Societies, actually, in the last 10 years, what I also see is going through tremendous change. That kind of change would generally would take place over some more time span. Is that also okay? This is change at a different level. Is that also what you see in Europe and in US, since you straddle both sides? So changes in terms of the speed of changes, is that also what you see? In may the changes may be something else.
I see it. The changes are different because but I do think there are changes that are very difficult in the West that are very difficult for us to comprehend. For example, I have sons in my 20s, and their preoccupations are so different from ours, and they have to be. We tried always not to be nostalgic because we don't want them to feel that the world is not a good place. But they're angry that they're being left with climate change, and they're right to be angry. We made a mess of that. Their relationship to gender is completely different than ours was, you know? Their relationship to sexual difference is completely different. They're very progressive, but at the same time, they're always feeling pinched by the world. And I think that that brings its own stresses. And I also think it's going to be very hard for them, given the world economy, for them to live, to earn more, for example, than we did. And that's just the way it's going to be. It's not the end of the world, but the world is changing so quickly. They too have to adjust, you know? They have no problem, that generation, adjusting to the idea that Europe is no longer the master. That doesn't worry them. In fact, they look forward to it. Those are my children. It's not true of all Europeans. It's very interesting. Many Europeans, I think Americans in particular, still want to think that they're going to, be the great power forever and that they can determine the future of the globe. But it's clear that that is not going to be the way it is. That the world is changing so fast now. And I also think the greatest changes came with the revolution in communication. I do think that we spend our heads in books and they read books too, but they also spend a lot of time on social media and visual media. And it's just a different way of getting information.
I like the terminology used, revolution of communication, because that, I think, you've hit the nail on the head. That on all sides, the speed may be different, levels may be different, and the deep connections actually you have with the East. We've crossed three continents today, the East in terms of Asian continent, America, and Europe. So it's actually one is able to see like on a whiteboard what was the past a little bit and a little bit of what is happening in the present, the turmoil and the turbulence. Last question to you as we leave the audience. What would be your advice or takeaway for the audience today? You've read widely, written widely, done so much of research, gone into history, the back end. You've been at the nexus of spirituality, religion, culture, gender. What would be your inspirational giveaway of it all, as a juice of it all?
The inspirational giveaway is to further communication, but at a deeper level. That is, why I agreed to do the podcast. It's not just through a text or a sound bite, but to try and talk to people often that you don't know and to try and understand each other, what they're interested in, why it's different from your interests. And that is to have a kind of exchange that isn't doctrinaire, isn't demagogic, isn't hysterical, isn't screaming, and isn't just 20 seconds.
Thank you for that takeaway. It was very deep, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'll probably come back to you with some more questions because there were topics we touched on which would need a little more revelation. Meanwhile, I wish you a good day. Thank you once again, and a namaste and a bye bye.
Namaste. Bye.
And that, dear listeners, is Ruth Harris for you. Her message about communication is, I believe, the second step to a peaceful world. And what is the first step? In my opinion, it is intention that points awareness in a certain direction. Communication that Ruth mentioned is the ability to interact with the intention to understand people of multiple cultures and their motivations, what drives them, what motivates them. Only after understanding can one ably transmit a message which is also taken in the same spirit of peace. Today, we have had the opportunity to dive through the ages and view multiple influences between the East and the West through Ruth's lenses. What is your take? As initiators of a global dialogue between the East and the West, we always remain open to views and opinions. Do write in and tell us. Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.